Welcome everyone across Canada to our monthly by name list and coordinated access webinar series. We're excited to have you today, and we're excited to have some additional great information that's going to be presented today. I'll introduce the presenter here in a couple of minutes. But just to get things started, a few housekeeping items. We are recording this, and so if for some reason you happen to get unmuted, please make sure that you are keeping track and that you stay muted. Technically, you will only be unmuted if we do that for you. But just in case, we want to keep the background noise down so that we have a clean recording. We are also going to, if possible, at the end of the presentation, if there is time permitting, we'll be having time for some questions and discussion. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat or the Q&A feature as we go along. If you have a microphone and are open to talking online, then we'll unmute you so that you can have a conversation with our presenter. But if you don't have a microphone, then we'll read the questions out for you. So we are happy to be here, and we're going to get rolling on things. My name is Wally Check. I'm the Director of Training with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm happy to be your host for today. And just to, again, highlight a little bit about the Canadian Alliance, we have sort of 4 key areas that we work out of. We have the conference, of course, which many of you have attended in various years. This last year was in Edmonton, and it's been announced that next year's conference will be in Toronto. Just as a note on that as well, there will also be an International Housing First symposium that will be happening the 2 days prior to the Canadian Alliance conference. So another opportunity to participate in some things there. We also have Built for Zero Canada, which is, as it states in the description, an ambitious movement and program in working with select communities around coordinated access and by name list. And our presenter today has had lots of involvement with Built for Zero as well. We have the training and technical assistance, which I said is the program I am responsible for, and we've been doing lots of trainings throughout Canada for the last 2 or 3 years, and we continue to also support other designated communities in their coordinated access and by name list work through Reaching Home funding. And then we have the Allied Networks, which is a collection of various different organizations and stakeholders that the Canadian Alliance has partnered with, such as the shelter networks, which actually our presenter is involved in that as well. We have the rural and remote, the Canadian Alliance for Rural and Remote Homelessness, and we have lived experience organization, veterans groups, different people like that who are involved that we work with and support through that partnership. Our mission, of course, is essentially to help Canada end homelessness, and we're really excited to have people like our presenter today to be partnered with, as well as other organizations and stakeholders that we work with to move that forward. But most importantly, you, the communities, and the folks that you work with there, we're happy and excited to be able to do lots of work with all of you. We want to mention and highlight the federal injection or agreement that we have with Reaching Home. What's happening today and a lot of the work that we're doing around coordinated access and by name list is funded in part by the Government of Canada. So we're really grateful for their involvement and their willingness to put their trust in all of us to do some of that work. Just as a note about webinars, again, typically a webinar is primarily a presentation. Sometimes there's time for question and answer, and if there is, our presenter will let us know that, and we'll be able to address that then. And then just our agenda today. I'm going to introduce our presenter. He will provide all of his fantastic information. And then again, as I said, there will be time towards the end, possibly for question and discussion. And then there'll be a couple of closing comments, and we'll be finished for the day. So without any further ado, I'm going to actually just close out of this presentation and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to our presenter. And I'd like to introduce who many, or if not all of you know, Ian DeYoung, who is responsible for the development of org code and leading the way in all of its work that it does across the country. Ian has been involved for many years in dealing or working with communities across Canada for Housing First and multiple other best practices related to ending homelessness. And he's definitely been a big part and a strong advocate for coordinated access and by name list development in Canada. And so that's one of the primary reasons that we have him providing this webinar today, as well as others that he's done and will do in the future. So the topic today is around prioritization, and I will turn it over to Ian to be able to share his screen and his slides and his presentation. So Ian, take it away.
Just getting the screen sharing ready. As I work towards getting the screen set up for everybody to see, I'd just like to extend my thanks to the Canadian Alliance for having me involved in these webinars, and a big shout out to all the communities from across the country that are here to participate in the conversation around prioritization. And when we look at the work of prioritization, what we're really looking at is, how does your community go about making the decisions that are necessary to put the right family or individual in the right order relative to other families and individuals, so that we can be in a position where we are meeting local and national objectives towards ending homelessness. And I don't see my screen up yet, so I will continue to work on this.
This is sometimes a challenge. Technology doesn't always be our best friend.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's there.
All right. So today we're focused on the prioritization part of coordinated access. We've done previous webinars that looked at things like access points assessment, and now we get into the piece around prioritization. So let's cut to the chase in terms of what actually is the purpose of prioritization. And by extension, what is not the purpose of prioritization? So I would say that prioritization starts by looking at a process by which your community is going to go about determining if you have, for example, two individuals, single adults who are experiencing homelessness, both of whom are in need of housing. You have one housing spot available on a caseload. How would you go about developing a community process that would allow you to discern between those two individuals which person you would make the offer to first? But there's also an action-oriented element of this, which is, once we actually make the match, and there's a future webinar that gets into matching, but once we actually make the match, how do we actually get that person to a place where they are offered that unit? So we don't want to take away consumer choice in the process of prioritization. We still want to allow an individual who is experiencing homelessness, or a family experiencing homelessness, to have an active voice in deciding where they want to live. So prioritization does not equal placement. Prioritization equals offer for housing. And what we're looking at is the importance and urgency of serving one particular household ahead of another. And how do we do this? We use transparent and defensible criteria. So by way of transparent, those are the policies and procedures that will be developed in your specific community, that would be understood by the series of service providers that are within your communities, funders, and even people who are experiencing homelessness, and that it's defensible. So not just arbitrary ad hoc approaches to how we go about determining priorities, but rather that we can actually say that there are legitimate reasons why a particular household with one set of characteristics would be served ahead of a household with another set of characteristics if there's, for example, just the one unit that's available. So we cannot engage in a conversation around prioritization without having a conversation around what are we prioritizing for. And this is probably the first major challenge that communities are faced with in the prioritization process. It's not uncommon for a community, especially let's say one with a 311 type program, to have an inventory of all the different organizations that provide services and supports and housing. But it's something completely different to get another level of detail that would make it operationally possible to engage in a prioritization and matching process for that available unit. So we need to undertake some in-depth service mapping. And for each population groups, singles, families, youth, you have to have a complete inventory of every housing resources and know the eligibility criteria for each. If you are in a smaller community, this is a relatively straightforward process. A medium-sized community, probably a bit more drawn out. If you are in a large community or a metropolitan area, this can be a significant undertaking, and especially understanding the eligibility criteria for each. So if we have an individual with, let's say, presentation of A, B, and C, but the housing vacancy or the spot on a caseload only serves people with D, E, and F, well, we would have a mismatch of what the individual's presenting characteristics are and what the actual eligibility criteria are for that available unit or spot on caseload. So we really need to understand what we are prioritizing to make the prioritization process work. We need to know all of the eligibility requirements, and those also have to be transparent. So we say what is written on paper has to be what occurs in practice. No unwritten rules. I'll give you an example of an unwritten rule that we've encountered in another community is a supportive housing provider that had an unwritten rule that they could only serve 3 to 5 tenants with severe and persistent mental illness at any one time. It doesn't exist anywhere on paper that that's the case, but they are in a position where they say, look, once we get to like 6 or 7 tenants with severe and persistent mental illness, all are symptomatic at the same time, it's just impossible for us to manage. Well, if that's true, and I'll say if that is true, then it's important that sort of information is relayed in advance of the prioritization process so that we don't prioritize an individual for a unit that they wouldn't get access to when the match actually occurs. We have to actually know what the eligibility criteria are, not the population preferences. What does that mean? Well, it really gets down to this. There will be some providers of housing and supports who will say things like, we really need a low to moderate acuity candidate right now. We have too many high acuity individuals that we're supporting right now, or too many high acuity families that we're supporting right now. And we'll say, okay, so that sounds like a population preference, not an eligibility requirement. So if your program actually serves people of higher acuity, choosing a population preference that flies in the face of your eligibility criteria is going to be problematic. We should be in a position where we're closing side doors. I mean, a side door is any mechanism that allows an individual or family to access housing outside of coordinated access, separate and apart from them securing their own housing in the private market. So any sort of program approach that provides access to people in housing, we want to make sure that they only go through coordinated access and not through side deals or agreements either internal to an organization or between partner organizations. That we want to be able to have some sort of database or understanding that's transparent of these particular eligibility criteria. And then this becomes a really important element for some providers who have an historic practice of saying things like, well, if Ian is going to be recommended for housing at our building, we need to meet with Ian first, or the other existing tenants need to meet with Ian first, and they will decide whether or not Ian's a match. So coordinated access works to remove that from the process, a process that is pretty problematic in terms of how arbitrary it is, but also the fact that it's not a transparent process. We can't know in advance what the meeting criteria is, and it would disrupt the entire coordinated access process if we have, for example, a candidate who's prioritized, but the ability for people to veto that connection on relatively subjective grounds. So what do we need to know in Catalogue for each housing and support resource? Well, we need to know things like the name of the program, the address, the intake contact person, and given that there's turnover, we need to know that things have been updated if the contact person changes. We need to know the type of program that it is, how many units that they have, whether it's scattered or congregate, what sort of rent or fee structure there is. We need to know which type of households they serve, and I gave examples here, 2 examples of where, for example, you can have a provider says we serve families, but then you uncover that they don't serve really large families. So is there like a maximum family size? Or if they serve women who are pregnant, what about once the woman has given birth to the child? Will they still serve them, or is it a singles building? So what type of households do they serve? Whether or not they have specific types of homelessness that they're targeting in their work of case management supports or supportive housing. So things like a building that is specifically dedicated to serving formerly chronic homeless individuals, or victims of domestic and intimate partner violence, or individuals who are unsheltered. We also need to know things like, are there specific attributes or conditional preferences in the individual? So you might have a program specifically designed for people living with mental illness. So you would want to make sure that you're only matching people living with mental illness to be a priority for those specific vacancies in that program. Whether they serve everybody in the country or only Canadian citizens. If they serve people with a criminal history, are there any types of criminal histories that they don't serve within their building? And in particular, things like arson being a big one. So if you had someone who has a history of setting fires to previous residences, will they be served in this future residence? Do they have any income or employment requirements? And then everything else that might be in place in your specific community. So examples include things like past evictions from a particular property, and is there like a time period? So if I was evicted in 1997, am I eligible to come back in 2020? What about if I have arrears owing, am I an eligible candidate? Do you have any mandatory program participation like a life skills class, budgeting, employment, etc.? Does it matter how frequently I've accessed services? What if I have a pet? Is there any sort of analysis of sustainability that goes in? So those and any other eligibility requirements have to be known prior to doing prioritization and the matching part that follows prioritization. So once we have the service map created and we know all the different housing and support resources, both scattered site and congregate within our community, we have to ask ourselves, if there were vacancies in any of those programs, how would we make a decision for each population group to have access? So it's important to remember that population groups are not in competition with each other through coordinated access. And what that means is the priorities that you put in place for single adults should look different than, say, the priorities you put in place for families. They don't have the same priorities. So family priorities are family priorities, single adult priorities are single adult priorities, youth priorities are youth priorities, etc. That said, what we're really getting into to ensure that there's not competition is this idea of setting aside a set number of units per population group. Let's look at the example of like youth and single adults in particular, because in this particular instance, we're talking about individuals who have no other dependents with them, and let's just, for the sake of argument, exclude couples without children for the time being. We wouldn't say that the youth and the single adult, if there's a vacancy, would be in competition for the same unit, we would say that we already know in advance in our community what percentage of vacancies will be offered to youth versus what percentage of vacancies will be offered to single adults, so that those two are not in competition. Each population group has prioritization criteria for each type of support intervention. And this table here, just very simple table for illustrative purposes, shows, for example, that the prioritization criteria that we put in place for singles receiving rapid rehousing would be different than the priority criteria for single adults moving into supportive housing. Or the criteria for youth moving into a rapid rehousing program would look different than the prioritization category for youth going into supportive housing, etc. So we think about this being really a matrix for establishing 8 different set of prioritization criteria within this community. You have 4 different sets of prioritization criteria for rapid rehousing and 4 different sets of prioritization criteria for supportive housing. And that doesn't have to be like supportive housing in the strict sense of like a site-based building. That can include housing first programs, intensive case management programs, assertive community treatment programs. But if necessary, you can even break out prioritization criteria for each of those. You've heard the expression, I could ask you to type it in the chat box or we'll unmute you, but we won't because you all know this. If everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. How do we have these conversations around priorities such that we don't list every possible nuance of a presenting issue and saying that's a priority, but at the same token, not having so few priorities that our lists get to be so long and cumbersome that it's really impossible to make a decision relative to which family or single adult or youth is going to be a priority at any given time. Now, if we're going to stay true to reaching home, which I would strongly encourage you to do if you're a reaching home community, one of the clear priorities is to see a reduction in chronic homelessness. So if your community doesn't make chronic homelessness one of the variables for prioritization, I would say you're probably missing the message. Now, if we accept that reductions in chronic homelessness are important for reaching home and therefore are important in our community, that could be the first variable that you filter by, the second variable you filter by, the 5th variable you filter by, but I would say that it's pretty much has to be a given in every community that it's a reaching home community. The chronic homelessness, as per the definition used in reaching home, should be a priority for filtering information and making offers in your community. But how do you determine other community priorities? So I would say it starts with this process of mining your data. Which data? If you have data from assessments, the VAT, the YAP, the SPDAT, some locally created assessment tool, if you've had runtime in the use of that assessment data, I would start to look at what are the characteristics of those individuals and families in the moderate acuity bandwidth and the higher acuity bandwidth, and are there particularly relevant presenting issues amongst those individuals and families who are highest acuity and amongst those who are at the upper end of moderate acuity. That might be one example of mining your data. Another example of mining your data might be looking at lengths of homelessness and breaking those lengths of homelessness down into meaningful chunks, whether they're, for example, quartiles, quintiles, and getting a sense of what are the kind of natural breaks in length of homelessness within your community. So you, for example, could say it's not just chronic homelessness that we're interested in our community. We looked at our data and we see that there's a chunk of individuals and families that have been homeless for greater than 700 days. And so we want to say one of the variables that we'll filter our data by in developing a prioritization are those individuals that have been homeless 700 or more days. Or let's say, use one other example for mining your data. let's say that we want to examine individuals who have a high degree of engagement with other services like the healthcare system and the justice system. You mine your data, you isolate what kind of volume of individuals or families are we discussing in having those frequent service use contacts, and would it make sense for us to establish some sort of frequent service user variable for filtering our data for prioritization, so we make sure that the most frequent service users are definitely identified as a priority. So those are just a few examples of mining your data to understand where you may put it relative to the prioritization sequence. You also want to examine pressure points in your system. And this leads a little bit to the third bullet as well. Where is public and political sentiment with regards to certain types of homelessness? So one of the examples that we've seen in a number of Canadian communities in the past few years has been an apparent rise in the volume of unsheltered homelessness, and in particular, people in encampments in unsheltered homelessness situations. You could be in a position where you say, look, we got a pressure point on unsheltered homelessness. The public and political sentiment related to unsheltered homelessness is such that there's a strong desire for us or the community as a whole to do something about it. And therefore, we want to put unsheltered homelessness as a variable that goes into the prioritization in our community, or ensuring that a certain percentage of people who move into housing were unsheltered, or going a step further and saying unsheltered for what period of time. So, 7 or more months unsheltered and then a 12-month period would put you in a category where you're a greater priority for housing ahead of someone who is sheltered. Just as an example, again, this is not meant to be instructive, this is meant to be illustrative. These are the sort of conversations you need to be having in your local community. And then put here, consider situations that may thwart your best laid plans. We'll get to this in some of the later slides, but you should be thinking through those scenarios where you are pressured to have some people otherwise jump the queue. What does this mean? Let's say you had a really robust prioritization matrix for your supportive housing programs, your housing first programs, intensive case management programs, assertive community treatment programs, et cetera. And amongst those who are had the highest acuity, you said, in our community, we're going to give priority to the person that is chronically homeless and has been homeless for 700 more days and has 50 or more interactions with hospitals or law enforcement in any given year and has been unsheltered 7 or more years and had a score on the VI spit out of 13 or above. Okay, so that's your community. You said those 5 variables. If someone met all 5 of those variables, they'd be a priority for the next offer of a unit within one of your really intensive programs. Good. And then tonight, let's say that there was a fire in a motel that is known to accommodate a number of individuals in your community who are very low income and have a lot of the same characteristics as your chronically homeless population. You might feel the pressure in your community to say, yep, we have coordinated access, we have prioritization, but oh, this unfortunate thing happened and we're going to let everybody who is staying in the motel get the next offers of units ahead of the people that we put in our prioritization sequence. So you really got to think about those sorts of situations in advance and have some sort of like notwithstanding or with exception clauses if you think it's going to be prudent in your community. Otherwise, if exceptions become the norm, then prioritization really makes no sense operationally. So other examples of considerations in community priorities. So I mentioned unsheltered over sheltered. It's not uncommon for people to look at things like medical frailty over people who are unwell, and in particular things like tri-morbidity, frequent service users I mentioned, presence of specific health conditions. So you as a community might choose, in light of some recent Canadian research, to house people with brain injuries ahead of people who don't have brain injuries. Acuity scores, this is just a handful. Other variables we've seen communities look at are things like age, and either wanting to do like really old adults for single adults or families with children of a certain age, or amongst youth, looking at even just different age ranges within the youth population. That's not an uncommon one. Within the family realm, not uncommon to see variables like past history, and usually relatively recent history of domestic violence. With families, it's also not uncommon to see variables, things like children with special needs, as a variable, that if you had two families, one had children with special needs, the other one didn't, the family with special needs would get the offer of service first. Other things that might be considered that are more difficult to measure, but can still be used in prioritization, might include factors like otherwise service disconnected, so people who aren't making use of services. Or you might see a community make a decision with youth that says prior child welfare involvement, foster home, group home, those sorts of things makes them a higher candidate in prioritization. But this idea of considerations and community priorities are, after the process of service mapping and getting a complete inventory, probably one of the most difficult conversations to have as a community to get people on the same page. And I would say that the difficulty with that usually stems from the fact that service providers look through the lens of who they serve within their organization or their program or project within their organization. And that's well and good, but sometimes can lose sight of the big picture. What's happening with people who are homeless outside of their specific organization? In what ways are the population that they're serving the same? In which ways are the population they're serving differently? Community priority setting is not an exercise in advocating for who you think is deserving based upon your project or program. It is an exercise in mining data and understanding the priorities of the community as a whole. It's not about winners and losers. It is about reconciling the availability of resources to the presenting needs of the population. Proportional allocation of resources allows us to address other issues potentially of inequity in our system without having to give prioritization to specific population groups who would otherwise be marginalized or a minority within our population. What is this really getting at? Well, let's look at the second bullet. Let's say 33% of your population identifies as Indigenous. You could say as a community, we're going to give 1/3 of our units first offer to people who are Indigenous, rather than saying being an Indigenous person is a prioritization filter. I realize that can be a little convoluted, a little complex, so let me kind of walk through that again. You have 10 vacancies in your community right now, full stop. Doesn't matter if they're rapid housing, doesn't matter if they're supportive housing, just you have 10 units that are available right now. You would say, we're going to make sure that at least 3 of those units are offered to people who are Indigenous. Now, when we then look at prioritization criteria, we could say, of those 3 units, of all the people who identify as Indigenous, which individuals meet most of our prioritization criteria or all of our prioritization criteria, to ensure that there is greater equity within your system, rather than being in a position where you'd say Indigenous will always be served ahead of non-Indigenous persons. Proportional allocation allows you to have throughput in your housing processes and programs in ways that are representative of your homeless population. In this process of establishing community priorities, there is often debate and conflict. And one of the ways that we can address that is entering into our conversation about prioritization of how long will these be our prioritization variables for? And it is our experience that getting people to agreement of approximately 18 months, maybe as short as 12 months, as long as 24 months, but kind of that 18-month period says, for the next year and a half, these will be our priority elements. we'll have a process heading into that 18-month deadline of reviewing our priorities and making a determination of whether or not any of the priorities need to change. But for the next 18 months, these are priorities for singles rapid rehousing. These are priorities for singles supportive housing. These are priorities for families rapid rehousing. These are priorities for family supportive housing. These are the priorities for youth rapid rehousing. These are the priorities for youth supportive housing. And if your community is working with and coordinated access survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, these are the priorities for rapid rehousing, and these are the priorities for supportive housing. So that 8-panel matrix, priorities in each category for each type of housing intervention for each population group for 18 months. It is not uncommon to get 2 or 3 months into your prioritization, operationalizing within your community, and having one or more service provider or staff person within organizations who essentially say, we need to revisit our priorities because these types of individuals or families are not being served through coordinated access. Not uncommon, happens about all the time. The challenge is, how do we make sure that we review what is possibly an error that was made in the community without immediately knee-jerking towards it was a mistake made in our community? In other words, is this particular worker's advocacy because they're sour grapes, that the people that they serve don't meet the community's priorities? Or is there legitimacy that we oversaw something in creating our community priorities? So runtime for 18 months might still have valid reasons for revisiting elements of it, but I would say as soon as you open that door of starting to re-examine any of the variables that you had set in place for prioritization in your community, you run the risk of priorities changing week to week, in which case prioritization becomes about the flavor du jour, not about some meaningful analysis that's driven by data and community conversation. And if your priorities are ever changing, they're not really priorities. So you have a by name list. We need to get to a coordinated access list and then on to a priority list. And they are different things. So the by name list is every individual and family that is consented for service and you know them by name. The coordinated access list is a subset of those that are active and those with whom you're working on getting them paper ready. Priority lists are subdivided by population group and type of housing intervention, so like the 8-box matrix, and include only those individuals and families that are active, are paper ready, and are imminently ready to move into housing. So imminently ready to move into housing, I want to be really clear, doesn't mean that we think that they're housing ready in the kind of historic lens. Imminently ready means I's are dotted, T's are crossed. If you made the specific family, individual, or youth an offer for housing today, they're in a position where they could say yes or no based upon his, her, or their particular preference. How many priorities do you want for your community really is informed by how many names you have on your by name list. So if we want our priority list to really be dynamic and helpful for what we do in the matching phase, ideally we want it to be 20 names or less and probably no more than 50. That's in the priority list. You could still have hundreds on your coordinated access list, hundreds or thousands on your by name list, but getting it down to your priority list is, let's say, around 20 names or so for an available unit. So let's consider families, rapid rehousing. Do you have enough filtering variables for all the families that exist in your community so that when we look at our list of families that can move into rapid rehousing, we have about 20 or so family names that we can make an offer to rapid rehousing as soon as we have space in a rapid rehousing program? So the size of your by name list will inform how many prioritization variables you need to get that list on the priority list to a manageable size. If you have 250 people or less in your by name list, you probably need 3 or 4 filtering variables for prioritization. If you have 251 to 500 people, you usually require 4 or 5 filtering variables. If you have like 501 to 1,000 people, you usually need 5 or 6 filtering variables. If you have more than 1,000 people on your by name list, you're probably going to need 6 or more filtering variables for prioritization. That said, your community can choose what's best for you. I'm just giving you kind of ballpark understanding from the dozens of other communities that we've gone through this process with. And then you have to select your prioritization method, which in essence is laying the groundwork for your matching mechanism. So there are 3 dominant methods, something called descending acuity, something called frequent service user, and something called universal system management, which has many of the elements of dynamic prioritization built into it. In descending acuity, we go from highest to lowest in acuity based upon whatever assessment tool your community is using. It usually means that we have to have tiebreakers. So if we have 2 people with the same acuity score, how will we break that score? And in descending acuity, it's more common than not for there to be some sort of case conference meeting that goes into the matching process. We'll cover that in greater detail when the matching webinar occurs. And then you create a list from your HMIS or HIFIS that basically says, here's what the people's names are, here's what their acuity scores are, and we'll just go down in order from top to bottom. Frequent service users is a completely different approach. It doesn't look at acuity score as a sorting, filtering variable from the beginning. It looks at their engagement with usually health, justice and police, and homeless service resources. And it's important that your community articulate whether or not it has to be all 3, 2 out of the 3, any one of the 3, and whether or not comparisons are made across those 3. So if you had, for example, someone who had 100 ER visits and 50 interactions with police and spent 300 nights in shelter, then their service volume would be 450. But compare that with someone who has lived in shelter for 10 years, but has never accessed the ER and never had an encounter with police, where there are 10 years of engagement with shelter service, which is going to be, over 3,000 service encounters. Would that trump the person who has the 450 encounters across 3 different service areas? Those are the sort of things you need to sort out within your community. And you go usually in a descending order from your most frequent service users to your least frequent service users. One of the challenges with this approach is that by the very nature of being a frequent service user, that individual or family member isn't always in a position where they're imminently housable. So for example, Ian's name came up on the list. We wanted to be in a position where we offered housing to Ian, but he's hospitalized in the psychiatric ward of our local hospital. There's no discharge date that's known at this point in time. Do you want to hold the unit for Ian until he's discharged from hospital, or do you move to the next person on the frequent service use list who happens to be in a position where they are imminently housable? So there's some trade-offs that have to be made in terms of length of time that you'd hold a vacancy or program spot for an individual. These 2 can require case conferencing for matching in the process. Perhaps the most robust way of establishing community priorities is through universal system management, which considers a number of variables for prioritization at a time and does not necessarily require case conferences to select and do the matching process for tenants. And in this sort of process, we'd say that the emergency side of the system, so outreach, drop-ins, day services, shelters, they put clients on the list, and housing providers and case management programs take people off the list. So it generally goes like this. If I was a person working in a shelter who had a program participant, a shelter guest who I was trying to come up with a housing match for. In this particular instance, it was the VI spit out on the housing assessment form. It could be that you use the VAT. It doesn't really matter what the assessment tool is, but I've done the assessment tool and I've done some sort of housing assessment form. Housing assessment forms include things like preferences of where you want to live, affordability, whether there's legal restrictions on where they can live, etc. I then gather all the information that is going to be necessary and input that into HIFAS. So if, for example, we have a supportive housing building in our community that serves people 55 and above who have a mental illness, there's probably going to be some documentation required to prove that a potential candidate meets the age threshold and the mental illness requirement to even be matched. So whatever sort of eligibility criteria were known in your service mapping has to be the sort of information that we capture then when we look at having all the information that's placed in the HIFAS or HMIS. Our system then has a process for coordinated access to look at whether or not the person meets our prioritization criteria and whether or not all their paperwork is in place. If all of the eligibility criteria aren't met or the documentation for the eligibility criteria aren't met, we can kick it back to the worker. But let's assume everything is in place, then that individual or family is now on the priority list. So we've established what those community priorities are in our community. It would be fantastic if we could all reach consensus. I will say that's very hard to come by in prioritization. It usually has some sort of ranked voting system for our community to establish our priorities. And this slide outlines an approach that you can actually take to get people in your community to reach priorities for each population group and each type of housing intervention. All right, let me walk through one example of that so you can see what I mean. Let's say we want to establish the prioritization criteria for youth moving into supportive housing. I would pull together all of the youth providers and entities or organizations that have a vested interest in services to homeless youth who need really intensive services and supports to be successful in housing. Let's say, just for sake of argument, that is 10 people in my community who have that as an interest. Step one, without talking to any of their colleagues, I would want them to brainstorm all of the different variables that they might consider in determining whether or not a youth is top priority for supportive housing. They'd write out their own list, and let's say they came up with 15 things on their own list without talking to anybody else. I'd then ask them to look at their own list and put into place their own top 5. So maybe I am one of those service providers to youth in the community, and I decided that it was going to be chronic homeless youth who are living with a mental illness or cognitive impairment, who have previous foster experience, who are high service users, meaning that which we've defined in our community as 10 or more visits to the ER, ambulance ride, police engagement, incarceration within the past 6 months, and that the youth, in terms of our prioritization, would also be given prioritization status if they've been a victim of violence. So those are the 5 things we've said that I've said on my list. But then we compare them to your list of what you came up with, youth, and we might see that some are the same, some are different. So we can then see of all the 5 variables that I came up with and the 5 variables that you came up with and the next person came up and the next person came up with, remember there's 10 people in our community, how many people had the same thing as number 1 on their list? How many people had the same thing as number 2 on the list, number 3 on the list, number 4 on the list, number 5 on the list? Is there anything that, for example, I had number 1 on my list that you had number 2 on your list and another person on number 5 on their list? And then we can assign points to it. So here's an example from one community. Yes, the writing is small and difficult to read. This is for single adults in their community. And you'll see that of the 8 people that were involved in the process in this community, when it came to chronic homelessness, it got 4 first place votes, 3 second place votes, 1 fourth place vote. We say that you get 5 points for first place, 4 points for second place, 3 points for third place, 2 points for fourth place, 1 point for fifth place. Chronic homelessness got 34 points amongst the 8 people in this particular community. So it's really easy to say that the first filter that we look at prioritization by is chronic homelessness for single adults in this community. The second variable that they looked at was any of these physical, mental, substance use disorder. Third variable that they looked at was unsheltered. Fourth variable that they looked at was being 60 years of age or older. The next variable that they looked at was whether or not there's a physical or neurological disability. And the last variable that they looked at was 3 or more years homeless. And you'll see, if you look to the right side of above, there were some ideas that people came up with that didn't make the top sequence of the top, in this community, 6 variables that they want to look at. But if you look at the bottom, it says you'll get served in this order. So a person in this community gets served first if they are chronically homeless and have a mental health, substance use disorder, or physical health issue, and are unsheltered, and are 60 years or older, and have a disability, and have been homeless 3 or more years. And if we're still tied, then we'll filter them by VI SPDAT score in this community. Who would be served second? Well, all those criteria except for the 3 or more years. Who would be served third? All of those except for disability in 3 or more years. Who would be served fourth? All of those except for the 60 years or older, disability, 3 or more years, etc. So let's say we establish, this is another way of looking at it, a priority list in our community that says for our supportive housing, our served community treatment, our intensive case management programs, our top priority is going to be housing people who are chronic, 3 or more years, who are tri-morbid, who are outdoors, who had a VI SPDAT score of 13 or above, and then you can see what priority 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is. And oh look, we created different prioritization for single adults for rapid rehousing or our time-limited support programs, so priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we're looking at our permanent supportive housing provider matching list. So I made up these names, but let's say St. Bernard serves people who are priority 1, 2, 3, and 4, and Home Place serves people who are priority 5, 6, 7, 8. Davis Manor does all of them. MLC does 1 and 3. Moncanzi does 1 and 3. Let's say that there's a vacancy at St. Bernard's. They serve priority 1, 2, 3, and 4 candidates. So the first list that they would get is everybody who's priority 1. And that's where their prioritization would give the housing provider a list of potential candidates. It turns out it's these 6 people: Dirk Diggler, Jerry Maguire, Ferris Bueller, Darth Maul, Wilma Flintstone, and Britney Spears. And essentially what we're saying to St. Bernard is these 6 people all meet your eligibility criteria. They're all priority 1. It really doesn't matter which of these 6 people is housed, so long as it's one of these 6 people. But also doesn't take away consumer choice. So let's say we made the offer to Ferris Bueller first, and Ferris says, look, I don't know if I want to be housed right now. I don't know if I want to be housed at St. Bernard right now. Then he still stays on the priority 1 list, but doesn't get an offer from St. Bernard, or doesn't have to live in St. Bernard. Or we get around to offering Jerry Maguire and he's like, I wouldn't live in St. Bernard Place if you paid me $1 million. That place sucks. I have friends who live there. Fine. Jerry, you still have consumer choice. Then we move on to Brittany, and Brittany says, well, of course I want to live there. Well, then Brittany comes off our priority 1 candidate list. Brittany moves into St. Bernard Place. Regardless of our approach, to be on a priority list, someone has to go through coordinated access. There's no process for making someone a priority candidate if they don't meet your prioritization criteria. We do want them to be in that position where they're imminently housable. So for example, keeping track of people who pass away and taking them off the list, people who have been incarcerated for long periods of time, moving them to an inactive list, and being able to demonstrate that we have contact with the person. So to stay on the priority list, usually rules are established in the community that there's been some contact with that individual or family, usually within a 60 or 90-day period. Talked a little bit about the exceptions or top priority. So what if you're closing a large tent city? Do those people follow through your same prioritization criteria, or do you have an exception to the rule? I talked about like motel fire. What about someone who just advocates really loudly to elected officials? And then you have to have policies and approaches for persons not served well through coordinated access. So that could include the likes of people who have a substitute decision maker, people with profound developmental delays, people who refuse assessment but want housing, and families with ongoing changing composition, having policies and procedures to deal with those sorts of households in your prioritization sequence. And that's the highlights. I will now stop sharing my screen, and we'll see if there are any follow-up questions that people have that they put into the chat box with the couple of minutes that we have left.
Well, first of all, thanks, Ian. That was great. And I'm not going to take up too much time talking here because there is one question that has come from Ralph West. And maybe for sake of time, I'll just actually read the question. He says, as complicated as these prioritization systems are, they are housing focused. Does this presuppose that units necessarily come with financial and other supports? He says some units might automatically and others not. Do these sorts of problems arise? Is this a subject for the webinar on matching? And I'll leave it there. There's a supplementary piece, but I'll leave it to that one for now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we are talking about prioritization for units that have at least one of those two, financial or other types of supports. We are not talking about the matching or prioritization process for units in the private market that come without financial or other types of supports. So we are talking exclusively about prioritizing access to units that have financial and or other types of supports that come with them.
Okay, so you kind of touched on his follow-up question, which he says, if we have a financial subsidy to offer which is not tied to a unit, is that part of the prioritization system?
And I would say to that question, absolutely yes, because you're going to prioritize who would get that financial subsidy. So we're prioritizing people to available units. And on the flip side of that, prioritizing units to a pool of available people. If you have the ability to provide a subsidy to a person and that is attached to the person, could be applied to, let's say, any private market unit where the landlord is willing to accept the subsidy, then by all means that falls within prioritization. To whom would you prioritize giving that resource, that financial resource to?
Yeah, I think there's lots of times communities and organizations come up with that type of question, and I think that explanation around where those funds can and should go is important. I don't see any others. We've actually reached our hour time frame. If you just to end things though, if you were to sort of pinpoint what you think is kind of probably one of the key features of prioritization that you feel communities sort of stumble with, what would it be?
Great question, Wally. I think that perhaps the biggest challenge are those that try to do prioritization based upon opinions versus those that do prioritization based upon mining their data. Mm-hmm. When there's good data mining that goes into the prior to the prioritization conversation, it's a little bit easier for people to wrap their arms around some rather pressing community needs that may be different than the opinion of a particular service provider who's a strong advocate for the people that they support. We need to be looking at the priorities of the community as a whole, not just the priorities based upon the opinion of one organization or one service provider.
Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you. Yeah, I've also noticed in some of my travels that that I was really grateful for the piece you talked about in regards to sort of the case conferencing element. I think there's a lot of communities that sort of forget that piece, and they try to kind of just stick with some, just sort of the very basic initial kind of numbers, and forget that there's a lot of other elements that can be shared and talked about to kind of sift through an individual situation. Do you have any quick thoughts on that?
I think we'll get into that more in the matching one, but I'd say that the great opportunity with case conferencing is we can ensure that some of the families and individuals and youth that otherwise have been forgotten are definitely top of mind in communities. So I think that's one of the great benefits. The other great benefit can be if we have a pool of candidates and we have the housing provider that's involved in the case conference, we can be talking more around the kind of culture of the housing provider and who would be a best fit for the culture, which is, you know, not easily captured in assessment tools and those sorts of things. So those are the positives. The negatives come about when a whole bunch of subjectivity is added to the case conference. In those instances, you have a worker or a advocate who's trying to get their client into housing, but it is almost saying like parts of the prioritization process are irrelevant. And when you entertain that sort of conversation in case conferencing, it just increases the amount of subjectivity and decreases some of the power of prioritization.
Right, right. Good point. Good point. Okay. Well, thanks so much for your time and for all the great information. Thanks to everybody who was on the webinar. We have reached sort of the end of our time frame. And just as a quick note, again, this webinar has been recorded, and by the end of the day today or in the morning tomorrow, it will be available on our website for people to review and watch again if they want, or to share it with someone else. Coming up, we're going to have Ian back on February 4th at, again, 1 o'clock Eastern time for a BNL CA webinar on matching and referral. We also have a Housing First Community of Practice call coming up on February 20th on community and social integration. And then we also have Ian back again on March 5th for another BNL CA webinar on data and improvement. Again, those are all 1 o'clock Eastern time. So Ian, we'll look forward to having you back on and having further learning from you. Appreciate your time and your knowledge. And thanks everybody for joining us. And otherwise we'll sign off and say goodbye.
Thanks everybody.